So I got right here the Kree Skrull War. This is one of the first ever Marvel comic book events. It's pretty awesome and really cool story. So what the hell happened? Before we get into that, I do want to touch on two quick things though. First of all, you should subscribe to Comic Island for more cool top 10 videos like this one. Second, it should be noted, however obvious this might be, that I'm not really talking about every single crossover published in the last couple of decades. Some I like a great deal, or at the very least can tolerate or find value in. But too many of these events have too many of the problems we are about to talk about, even some of the good ones. This is especially true of Marvel, but just about as true for DC. Though in defense of both of these companies, they have been doing a pretty good job lately. Not a lot of what I'm about to talk about really applies to stories like Absolute Carnage, House of X, or even Dark Knight's Metal. But a couple of good examples hardly excuse the ocean of terrible events we've gotten over the last several years, and today we're going to talk about why that is and what's gone wrong with all of these stories. Number 10. Reboots. First up is something terrible for the industry, but is saved from being higher up in the top 10 since it doesn't accompany every single event, thankfully. But it does happen more than I would like, and every big current event or crisis that comes from either company always seems to have that potential knife in the dark you have to worry about in the form of some sort of reboot following any given event. If you talk to any comic book retailer, one of the biggest complaints they get from customers is the endless reboots from DC, but most especially Marvel, that make things confusing and frustrating. By reboot, I really mean anything from a soft reset like Marvel usually does to a full-blown, complete change in continuity like DC has done with New 52, or to a lesser degree Rebirth. Regardless of the specifics of the reboot, what really happens no matter what is a series like Miss Marvel or something like that will run for 12 issues, get bogged down in some sort of crossover event, and then restart its numbering entirely. But the storylines that were going on keep going on like nothing happened. These things are okay every once in a while, but when they start to happen every other year, or even every year, even the biggest fans of comics start to get lost in the details of everything. Number 9. Pacing. Now here is a problem that affects just about every modern Marvel and DC crossover event, even the best among them. All of these stories have some nightmare sense of pacing, and they all kind of follow the same frustrating pattern. It usually goes an introduction, which is all suspense, we get this new threat, and there's this power overwhelming our heroes. They stand no chance of getting past this threat, even though this threat is functionally identical to every other threat that's come before. And sure enough, there's usually a big setback right out of the gate. Maybe Earth gets conquered, maybe a major team or character gets clobbered by the main threat, but something happens that makes everyone go, oh dang, this is a big deal. The rest of the story is then usually spent with the heroes arguing with each other, or we spend a lot of time thinking about the event itself, building everything up. They'll deal with the fallout of that first big introduction, that big blowback moment, and then this is where most of the tie-ins start to happen. Sometimes those tie-ins are great and really showcase a cool idea being featured in the series. Convergence, Secret Wars, Dark Knight's Metal, these are all stories that really use their tie-ins very effectively. But most of the tie-ins are just heroes saving civilians, making whatever vague statements about the characters involved without really getting them involved in the larger story. Nothing that usually affects the overall story of the crossover in any meaningful way or the characters of the tie-ins in question. And that goes right up until the last issue or two of the main event miniseries, at which point an ending is crammed out so fast you'd swear the writers forgot to ever even think of one to begin with and literally improvised something while the comics were in the process of being drawn. Not every event follows this pattern exactly, obviously, but it is a habit that applies to even my most favorite of comic book events. I think that has to do with the way these stories are put out, and we'll kind of get into some of that stuff as we go on. But suffice to say, this pacing, while it can be a minor nuisance in a good event, becomes an omnipresent nightmare in bad crossover stories, making the bad events that much more boring and frustrating to begin with. Number 8. Diminishing returns. This one is very basic because it's pretty obvious. A company can't keep banging that drum with one world-ending event after another, but Marvel and DC do this so often it feels like nothing means anything anymore. I'm not sure how often New York City can be destroyed before the people just give up and move on entirely, condemning the entire island to its inevitable doom. Seeing the heroes fighting all together in some big desperate battle, that's not a special feeling anymore. That's actually something the MCU kinda does right, and they pace out those moments across years. But in the comics, these endless crossovers have effectively taken that feeling away from us, and I think it's more than fair to resent them for that. Number 7. Rushed or wasted art. Next up is one of my most common complaints about crossovers, and it kinda shocked me that I had to rank it this low. But there are problems that go far beyond the art in these comics. I find most, but not all comic book events suffer from one of these two problems. Either the art is not very good, either not the best quality or full of printing errors, likely because crossovers like these are difficult to produce to begin with, but especially so frequently as they are these days. Or, and this one is way worse, and tends to happen more often, the art's actually amazing, but the story is trash. Rushed art in content that everybody is supposed to be reading as some sort of flagship title makes no sense. But high quality work that isn't used effectively is so much worse. The whole situation is entirely the fault of the companies themselves for putting these artists in these impossible positions, either having to draw these things with no time, or draw these things that make no sense. And I hate the whole dynamic behind it. Number 6. Breaking characters. A common occurrence in these crossovers is the need for writers to bend all these well-defined characters in ways that force the heroes to behave so out of character you kinda get whiplash. From Emma Frost's action during the Inhumans vs. X-Men story, or where half the Justice League gets turned into outright criminals during Identity Crisis. There are too many examples of this. One of the worst might be Carol Danvers during Civil War II, where she is slowly twisted into something little better than an outright fascist. It is pretty self-evident why something like this would be bad. I understand the need to sometimes bend a character a little bit to fit a story. Maybe they make a bad decision in a key moment. That happens in real life sometimes. A lot of great stories do this very well. But these crossover events do it so often, and they stretch their characters so much and so far, that I sometimes just feel a little embarrassed on behalf of Marvel and DC. Civil War II and what it did to Carol Danvers is embarrassing for a character that has this big, bright, cinematic future. Number 5. Repetition. I think a lot of the fatigue that people feel with these tidal wave of events has to actually do with how similar these stories are with each other. Every once in a while we'll get something that should be really original and different, like Event Leviathan or Original Sin. Those stories set themselves up as a big mystery, but ultimately, they just become the same sort of super serious, globe-trotting adventure that all these other events usually are. Whenever a crossover event actually dares to be different, like say when the entire Marvel multiverse was made into one planet carefully crafted and controlled by an all-powerful dictator, those events are pretty damn cool. But Secret Wars is rare, while stuff like Trinity War, Secret Invasion, or Civil War II are sadly all too common. And because of that, when a great story like Absolute Carnage does come around, I find it's hard to convince people it's even worth checking out, because they've been burnt so many times by Marvel on this front before, getting the same old crap over and over again. I have a hard time blaming them for not believing that there's stuff out there that's actually new and different. Number 4. No consequences. It's not unfair to judge these events for not having lasting consequences in the larger canon, because that's how they set themselves up. It's the sort of thing that gives some of the stronger modern events out there, like Civil War, Forever Evil, and Avengers vs. X-Men, feel as though they have a weight to them, because they do actually change things and did have a larger impact on Marvel and DC storytelling going forward. It also helps to alleviate what would be a pretty consistent weakness in the design of these crossovers. By their nature, they are all short-lived miniseries featuring many characters, meaning that they sort of have to set themselves up as changing things long-term for these characters, because we can't really invest in the sort of development that we would need to have a self-contained story. A good event will actually have that longevity for that reason. This can take the form of many things, but it usually has to push past the comic book death trope to some degree. For example, on the Marvel side, Civil War did mark a few deaths, including Captain America himself. But what really mattered and what really sunk in were the changes in character dynamics, this new sense of betrayal between the superhero community. It never felt like it truly went away either. Captain America and Iron Man went to war with each other and never could shake that sentiment. Even after all this time, things have never really been the same between them. Events like Siege and Avengers vs. X-Men were ultimately about teams and groups coming back together where they had once been apart. There was a great sense of excitement because of these stories, because in the case of Siege, the core 3 Avengers were finally back after being gone for years. And in the case of Avengers vs. X-Men, they were getting a new and exciting team created specifically to address the divide between Avengers and X-Men, and we were finally at least supposed to be getting new mutant characters back then. On the other hand, if you look at a story like Inhumans vs. X-Men, which is full of moments that feel like they should define a character like Scott Summers or Emma Frost, all that stuff feels completely forgettable now because anything going on with them and the X-Men have essentially been abandoned for better things at this point, and for good reason. Without consequences either before or after these events, they become easily skippable and lose any sense of traction to them. They get talked about less, and these stories don't ultimately matter to us. There's certainly a balance to be struck here. You don't want characters and world building constantly beholden to the latest comic book event with everything changing and flowing because of them. But unfortunately, we usually don't get either of those things happening. Instead, what consequences we do get are even worse than what I've talked about so far. Number 3. Empty death. Next is something I'm sure a lot of people saw coming in this video. I've kind of danced around it already a little bit. Many of these stories seem to have trouble finding any meaningful consequences in their events, and that has a lot to do with how these events are released, as well as the whole diminishing returns thing, since at this point, destroying a city doesn't feel like all that much anymore, even though it feels like it should. So of course, another thing writers do in these stories to make it feel like something big is happening is they kill a character or two off. We all know why that doesn't work though. For one thing, neither Marvel or DC are willing to commit to killing off a major character for any period of time anymore. For another, that once again feeds directly into the whole diminishing returns thing. Did anyone feel anything when Black Widow died in Secret Empire? Given that it was hinted she would return before the story had even fully wrapped up, I doubt it. Because that's something else these comic book events have been doing, is already teeing up the character's return right away to sort of blunt the blowback of killing off the character in the first place. And so this silliness happens again and again. Sometimes a character is killed off early on in the comic book story to prove how big a threat the new event bad guy is. Sometimes they die halfway through, again to establish that this event is playing for reals. And sometimes the hero has to make an ultimate sacrifice to save the day and die at the end. It doesn't matter. They'll always be back soon enough, no matter what. Number 2. Lack of build-up. We've already talked about one event in Marvel's more recent history called Secret Wars. I think everything behind that story sort of serves as a good model for what those crossover events could and should be. It didn't actually have a lot of consequences on the continuity, but it was just basically a full run of Avengers comics had all been leading up towards this. And that build-up made everything in Secret Wars feel big and game-changing, as if everything since Avengers vs. X-Men had been essentially leading to that particular point. Which, to be fair, it pretty much was. That was the plan. There were plenty of events between Avengers vs. X-Men and Secret Wars, but with the possible exception of Axis, very few of them felt like they had any sort of meaningful build-up to them. My point should be clear by now that build-up definitely helps make these events great. They create hype organically as opposed to the way most Marvel and DC events sort of have to shove hype out the door from the very beginning and through marketing. I definitely think Marvel and DC could benefit a great deal from slowing things down a little bit and letting that build-up occur more naturally in the storytelling. Let it come out in different series and in small bits over time until people start knowing about it and talking about it, and we're finally ready for a cool event. I mentioned Axis earlier, and part of the reason why that worked so well is it wasn't originally supposed to be an event to begin with, just the ending to Rick Remender's Uncanny Avengers series. Marvel correctly saw that it was a big idea worth expanding on, and the end result was an event that had a whole series building up to it, rather than just something that was drumming up attention for no reason. Number 1. Volume and bloat. We've been dancing around this point since the very beginning, and it very much informs everything we've talked about so far. to the extent that it wasn't originally at the number 1. It just felt the natural conclusion to put it here as I was writing this script. The issue isn't so much the quality of these events or how they are handled. I think we could weather both of those as comic book fans pretty easily. But more accurately, everything kind of gets twisted and broken because of the sheer number of events that take place year to year. Most of what I've talked about so far, everything from comic book deaths to how it's been paced out, like I said, it should be fine. It would all be fine, or at least more tolerable, even under the worst of circumstances, if it only happened once in a while. Maybe every few years or so, instead of, on average, a couple of times a year. But these crossover events over the last decade keep feeling like they increase in volume. That volume of content informs pretty much every other problem on this top 10 video to a great extent, most especially because of the nature of diminishing returns, and the fact that they tend to make all the problems we've talked about that much worse because they just keep happening over and over again. And because of tie-in comics, they tend to interrupt other series in unnatural ways too often, becoming an unwelcome distraction. Sometimes tie-ins are great and I can't get enough of them, but those feel like exceptions, not the rule. I would say the norm for tie-ins is all they ever really do is add to the bloat. It makes it difficult to keep track of the event, it drives more readers away, and it makes casual, potential, and new readers intimidated by the sheer volume and characters you're suddenly supposed to know about all at once for any given crossover. And the sad thing is, thanks to the bloat, pretty much every event has something of value somewhere in its maze of tie-ins and special issues, but those moments are often lost in the weeds of everything else. I wouldn't even be able to tell you the best tie-in in a vast majority of these events because I haven't read them all, and I don't really intend to anytime soon. Like I said earlier, volume and bloat wasn't always ranked at number 1 for me, but the more I thought about it, the more clear the decision to ramp up the number of these events had lasting problems on not just the events themselves, but on the entire brand of both Marvel and DC. But that's enough talk for now. If you'd like to see more top 10 videos, please feel free to share any ideas you might have in the comments section below. This is one I've wanted to do for a while, and it's felt like a long time coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time here on Comic Island.